You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Friday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. You can watch the simulcast of this video in my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts. Just go to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. You can also join the chat room there, where right now are gathering all of the people who like to listen to this show over there on that channel in video. And you're going to join the Intrepid family. Come and check us out. Join the conversation live during this show. And you can talk over there about all different kinds of things. So come on over, join up. And go check out Odyssey Radio, ODYSY1.com. Check up their whole lineup for shows that can entertain you and inform you throughout the entire day. Folks, tonight I want to dig into something that you all know is a love in my heart, and that is Star Trek. Now, I grew up, those of you who know me and have heard me say this before, I grew up on the original. Back in the 1960s, when I was a little kid, I saw my first Star Trek episode in its original run. And I didn't pick it up again until I was, maybe 8 or 9, somewhere right around 1969 to 1970. Started seeing all the daily reruns of Star Trek, the original series. Kirk was my hero. And so I was a big Kirk, Spock, and McCoy fan. And that's how I grew up. And actually, there were a lot of things about the Kirk character that shaped who I was in my early years. That's a little hard to think of coming from a television character. But I've got some good articles on this. If you want to read a good article, go to my website. And it's scrolling down below if you're looking at the video. Or just go to scottallenroberts.com. Click on my articles link and go look up the article, "Oh Captain, My Captain." And that will give you a little brief on some of the ways that Star Trek affected me as a little kid and growing up into my formative years. So while that was happening, of course, once I was an adult, when I was 27 or 28 years old, because it released in 1988, was Star Trek The Next Generation came along. And this was, of course, years after the original series had been off the air, and everybody was dying to see something new. We had seen Star Trek The Motion Picture, we had seen The Wrath of Khan, we had seen the first couple of Star Trek films, then along comes Star Trek The Next Generation, with a bald captain, a very different kind of captain. He was action-oriented, but he was while Kirk was the militant, action figure captain of Star Trek, Picard became the intellectuals captain. He had his moments of action. He could handle himself very well, but he was a different kind of Star Trek represented by him. And that series really focused on the intellectual expansion of humanity, beyond just the action. And of course, action is what sells TV and adventure movies and things like that. And so we saw a lot of that. But Picard was a character that really reinforced that there is more to this all than action. And it also reinforced that there was a very human world from which he still hailed. And we started seeing, all kinds of conspiracies in Starfleet and things like that. Now, hopefully I'm not just preaching to the choir here. I think that there are some people out there who maybe don't know a lot about Star Trek, haven't been interested in it, haven't watched it. And I hope that what I'm going to do today, will help you understand where some of what I love about Star Trek comes from. And in a way, offering up several different little critiques and reviews of last night's episode of Star Trek Picard It's going to give you a little different taste and a little different feel for things. And by that I mean, just other than thinking of it like Rocky Stucci does, what's this Star Wars thing, this War Trek thing you talk about? Yeah, he fell asleep during Star Wars. So Star Trek to him, I remember about a month or two ago, Rocky started watching the original series, binge watching it. I don't know how far he ever got because I never heard anything again, but he was starting with episode 1 of the original series, Where No Man Has Gone Before. And he texted me, he says, okay, I'm doing it, Cannoli. I'm watching. And he kept messaging me with questions. What's the thing with the green sweater? Stuff like it. All his stupid questions. But so hopefully you're going to enjoy and glean a little bit of fun out of this, because that's all it is. I'm reviewing a TV show of a fictional character, but it's one that's become very iconic, especially for British actor, Sir, why do I want to say Picard? Not Sir Picard, Sir Patrick Stewart. And so I've pulled up a few things that I want to make some reference to. And this is I watched last night on CBS All Access. You got to subscribe to it for a few bucks a month. I subscribed to it when Discovery came out, Star Trek Discovery, 2 years ago. And now I have started watching on that channel the new series, Star Trek Picard. And this is all about Captain Picard, the main character of Star Trek Next Generation. And where he is now, some 15 to 20 years later than the end of the Star Trek Next Generation series. And I remember that series, it wasn't canceled. They just stopped after 7 years. And in 1994 was their last episode. That's 26 years ago already. It's hard to believe that. But that's how much time has passed. Now, since then, there is a fictional in-between storyline that it follows, and Picard himself became an admiral and eventually retired. He left Starfleet, and he had reasons he wanted to do this, which are starting to get revealed in this first episode. But now we always knew that in the old series that Picard came from a family that had a vineyard in France, and he retires to this vineyard, and he operates this vineyard. And so I'm going to pull some things from some different critiques of the show last night and reviews, but I want you to hear this, because I thought my first thing I'm going to introduce is, in watching Star Trek Picard, I was very pleased with how it came out. I felt that it was an elegant episode. It was it wasn't action and all of that, although it contained action. It focused on the kind of man that Picard has become, and I rather like the man that he's evolved into in this show. And be fair, he's a man in his 80s who's retired and running his vineyard, living the calm, peaceful life. And you see he's got a couple of Romulan, I would call them servants, but they're not really servants. They're people who work for him. And it explains why they're there. And the story starts to unfold. Now, I am not, while I am a Star Trek aficionado, while I grew up loving it and everything Star Trek, I am not one of those who's going to sit down and parse the whole thing to pieces, dissect it. I want to tell you how I reacted to it last night, and what I thought was what I thought was very moving about the Picard himself. We've gotten to know who this character is over the years. We saw him very well developed and fleshed out in the 7-year series that ran. And Star Trek Picard, I found, when you started hearing about them talking about doing this series, Patrick Stewart himself was slightly resistant at first. He said, why rehash something I've already done as an actor? But then he said, I will do this if I can call some of the shots here. I want this to be different than your average Star Trek show or spin-off. And, of course, as you watch the credits, he's the executive producer of the show. And or at least one of them. But this show, with him, I thought, really took us into what Picard is and who he was and who he became. And it starts off as a little softer, gentler. And you wonder where Picard is, where he's coming from, what's going through his mind. He's eased into this life of accepting old age. He's got his dog. He walks out into his vineyard. He's got his workers that work the vineyard. And so he sits into drinking wine, sitting by the fire, writing books, and in his retirement. And the quiet life, the quiet, gentle life. And this is what you're impressed with at the very beginning of the show. And then, of course, it moves into action. Something has to draw him back into being who he was in almost his former life. And do you think, I saw in one critique, do you seek salvation or guidance? Are you hankering for a grown-up who can sort everything out? Is leaving Earth and living in space increasingly tempting? Then 2020 might just be the right time for one of science fiction's most venerable heroes to make a comeback. And it's Star Trek Picard is a sequel to Star Trek The Next Generation, which ran from 1987 to 1994, and it has less cultural currency than the inaugural 60s series, but is, for fans, an upgrade from the Shatner-Nimoy years. And some of its kudos was earned by its deeper exploration of humanity, which we always found Picard to be a deep humanitarian, a deep intellectual, who was also a captain who had to play his military role as well. And a lot of it was the appeal of Patrick Stewart, playing Jean-Luc Picard, the Starship Enterprise's captain, a capable negotiator, a problem solver, and when needed, sneakily badass. And sci-fi likes to fantasize about strong, reasonable leaders, and Picard is possibly the ultimate of those things: strong, capable, reasonable. And this that his show's reboot has allowed him to go titular is a measure of the imaginary man. Now, I have to think myself that Patrick Stewart, like we saw, say, with William Shatner reprising his role as Captain Kirk over the years, that in doing this, more Shatner came out in Kirk. Kirk really became Shatner, and Shatner became Kirk. They were one and the same. And I think what you see in Star Trek Picard is the real man, Patrick Stewart, coming out in the fictional character. And they've become, I think, almost one and the same, save for space battles and things like that. And the Jean-Luc Picard that we're reunited with in Star Trek Picard is an elderly gent, weathered by grief and regret, easing himself through the early 25th century by tending to the soil and his vineyard, or at least watching self-piloting drones tend to it, at the Picard vineyard in France. He's still the old Picard. He's steady. He's a bit pensive. He's got a profile like a granite backslash, but his time is filled with trivial routine. A walk with his dog, who he's named Number One, who was, of course, his first mate, I guess you'd call them, on his Enterprise voyages. And he now drinks, remember his typical line with the replicators? Tea Earl Grey hot. Now it's tea Earl Grey decaf. And so it puts it in a glass mug form. It's 3D imprinting if you don't know what the replicators are. And in the farmhouse, he has a glug of red wine in the warmth of dusk. And the big question that starts to come into your mind is, while you're watching, you're saying, this is Picard. This is the man he becomes. What would most military commanders and heroes, admirals, do when they get into their elder years and they retire? They have the quiet times. They reminisce. They write books. They do what they do. They look for ways to stay relevant. And so, while he's this country gentleman now, with a vineyard, you have to ask, what's down inside? You see the emerging grief and regret of things. Not that he lives his life out of regret, but you see that they're there under the surface. And you have to start asking what went wrong. Enthusiasts who've seen the 2009 film Star Trek or the 2002 Star Trek film Nemesis with Patrick Stewart, which was considered by most Star Trek enthusiasts to be probably not the best of their films. Stewart's last appearance as Picard was in that film in 2002. We already know the basics. For the casual viewer, full concentration is required as the Captain Exposition takes the controls. The vineyard idyll is disrupted by that old friend of the screenwriter desperate for an info dump, a film crew. How does Picard feel, he is asked on the news. What about the time he controversial spaffed valuable government resources trying to save millions of enemy Romulan civilians from a supernova? This is the big event in his past here. And pretty narked is how he feels as we sense the emergence of the Stewart who agreed to revive Picard when he realized a new series could be his reposit to Brexit and Donald Trump or whatever is going on in the world. So Star Trek's original vision was an optimistic one, where working for the Space Force Starfleet meant representing a federation of planets dedicated to integration and diplomacy. Now, adversity has spawned a distressingly 21st century brand of cruel isolationism. And Picard avers that if I can spit out my sentence, Picard avers that lives he wanted to save were lives, not Roman lives or Romulan lives, and that Starfleet ought to feel shame at having shrunk from its moral duties. So when he's in this interview, not too much of a spoiler, it's just something that helps the action move along. He has an interview with a news crew early on at his home, and he made it very clear there's certain things he didn't want talked about, and that's the only way he agreed to do the interview. And of course, what happens in the interview? They go attack dog and start talking about things, about his role that he played in trying to save millions, and as they said, millions of Romulan lives. And he looks up and he said, millions of lives. And he didn't want to differentiate between Romulan and human and so on. So this is where you see what Star Trek has always done, the little morality plays in the original. You see this carried into Picard in this series, in that he's focusing on what we have come to understand. Humanity is humanity, or life is life in his case, even though it's set in deep space. But this is reminiscing on something that happened much earlier, and they start showing news clips on the screen with him as they're doing the interview, and of course eventually he's fed up with that and he walks out. And he believes that Starfleet ought to feel shame at having left its resolve to help the Romulan peoples, who were one of their enemies, nemesis out there. Their planet was being destroyed by a supernova in this past story setting, and so he was part of the envoy, if you will, the mission to help rescue them, and he led this. And it led to some things that were his regrets and reasons he left Starfleet. And now, if this makes Star Trek Picard sound like a counterproductive Remainer kind of a podcast, don't be afraid of that, because Jean-Luc Picard has this personal mission to pursue too. The newly spiteful Federation has banned synthetic humans. Now, if you're familiar with the characters, Commander Data in the original series, Star Trek Next Generation, in that series, was a good friend of Picard's. He was a synthetic. He was an AI, very advanced, of course. And but the Federation has banned synthetic humans, scapegoating them after a few rogue androids committed a mass atrocity that set Mars colonies on fire. So you can see right now we're talking all within science fiction framework, but again, very human issues that we face now. And so they had a Mars attack. And that means more than a break on scientific progress. It potentially dooms Picard's departed robotic friend Data, played by Brent Spiner, to appear only in the dreams that strengthen Picard's resolve and lead him helpfully to the next plot point. This is no good. Time to haul that skin-tight velour out of the wardrobe, get the old gang back together and go guerrilla. You know, this is one of the things. I don't think it was that bad, but it was something that had to carry in Picard's dreams where he was going, the things that where his mind was in his subconscious one. Episode 1's other major consignment of necessary information comes when Picard visits Dr. Agnes, played by Alison Pill, Dr. Agnes Jurati, and she shares his dismay at the halting of robotic research. You can envisage Stewart presenting an urbane pop science series as, at Picard's donnish urging, Jurati holds forth on a prohibited new technology that could create entirely lifelike androids. This is like the merging, the infusion of humanity into AI, which Commander Data, who has mysterious beginnings in the old series, his version of being AI or robotic was very human. And so now this has all been put on a freeze, and all robotics are, in a sense, taken out of commission and in this series. And Star Trek Picard looks as if it's going to prowl the same ethical quandary galaxy as humans. Westworld, Battlestar Galactica. The last is probably the heavier influence on the way this is put together. And in between the ruminative Picard scenes are these promising action sequences involving the mysterious Daj, the young woman, an apparently ordinary young woman, who's surprised when maligning secret agents invade her apartment, kill her boyfriend, and even more surprised when she's instinctively knows how to kill them, how to stop them. And those blasts of hand-to-hand combat confirm that Picard exists in the new Trek universe of the fast special effects and destructive set pieces. But she also has these visions of Picard, who she doesn't know. And that's one of the opening sequences that takes Picard from the idyllic life on the French vineyard into the current action of where the series is going to carry us. And the big question is, a place where, after pleasing but not wholly elegant world-building opener, Picard can retain his calm, his careful, sightly authority, and it leads you to keep faith in the character. Now we got to go out to break. I'm almost overtime. Be back in 2 minutes. Hang on. All right, folks, we're back. This is Scotty Roberts. Welcome to my show, the Intrepid radio program. What you just listened to in the break was the opening theme music for Star Trek Picard. I thought it was as elegant a piece of music as the first episode of the series opened up last night. Elegant, beautiful, moving, and it pulls you in. And that's why I played that. So we're going to continue on here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com with tonight's show. And you can watch the simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel. And that is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. All right, let's get back into this critique of Picard and more about Picard. I think that there's some interesting things to find out about him. And there's this, I called up this little interview where Patrick Stewart, let's call him properly Sir Patrick Stewart, was interviewed prior to the show. And he appeared on Television Critics Association press tour, where he fielded questions during a panel session. And the following responses are what he gave. These are a bit edited down. He was asked a few questions about this new series. And he was asked, of course, the typical questions. What was it like to step back into costume all these years later? Meaning playing the Starfleet captain. And he said, well, he says, as Patrick Stewart would say, well, I only appear very briefly in my uniform, and this was another one of the rather presumptuous conditions that I laid down to producers. I didn't want to wear a uniform in this because I felt it very important that we put a lot of distance between Next Generation, Star Trek Next Generation, and what we're seeking to do here in this new series. Not ignore it, no, not at all, but so far as the character's concerned, halfway through Season 3 of Next Generation, I no longer knew where Jean-Luc started and Patrick Stewart left off, as I mentioned in the last segment. We became melded, and he has never left me. So there was actually nothing that strange to be stepping into Star Trek Picard, because he's never actually left me. He's always been there, and it's a relationship that I'm absolutely thrilled to continue. The next question was, did you think you would ever play this character again? Had you gone through the process of saying goodbye for good? Stewart says, oh yes, years ago. I was proud of the work we did on the 7 years on the series and the 4 movies that we made. The last one maybe had less impact than the others, and that brought the franchise to a close. I was very content with that because I felt very proud of the work we'd done. But the context in which the work was done, the fact that we were then, as we are now, an ensemble and not a star-led series, it's been far easier than I expected to make this transition nearly 20 years later. But because, as I've said, the man exists inside me, the interesting question for me is, and we talked about what I think for days about the backstory. What happened in those 20 years? So now I have a very, very clear vision, and a little snippets of that backstory will creep into the series, that I'm sure already has, because it's important that our audience get to know why we are living in the world that we are, and what is it that's brought that about. He was asked, has this role been a career burden at times? Playing anybody, by the way, who gets in a lead role in Star Trek, they're iconized for the rest of their lives. And he said, yes, I've been honest about this. I find quite soon after we wrapped the 4th of our movies, Nemesis, that I had hung a kind of albatross around my neck. This is a story I've told probably to every one of you at different times. I got an interview with a director who I was passionate to meet with because there was a role in his next movie, a small role I wanted to play, and he was very nice to me and saw me and said, I think you'll do terrific work, but why would I want Jean-Luc Picard in my movie? And that was a savage blow for quite a long time, and so I went out of my way to try to find as many diverse roles as possible, and that was fun. It's taken me a while, for me to truly absorb the impact of this work. And being with a new ensemble, you've seen already some of it, a brilliant ensemble, I feel. Once again, the sense of pride of being, I'm not the leader, but in a sense, I'm a kind of symbol. I'm very content to be that, because I think it's all about the quality of the work. Now, keep in mind, Patrick Stewart, renowned Shakespearean actor, before he ever took on the role of Picard. Now, a question came to him. Jonathan Frakes and Brent Spiner, respectively Commander Riker and Commander Data in the series, they appear in Picard. Is there anybody else from the Next Generation who's going to appear in the series? And have they all been calling you? And Stewart answers, we actually talk all the time. The whole Next Generation cast are very, very close. I love all of them, and they're very dear, dear friends. Jonathan, Marina Sirtis, Jonathan Del Arco, and Brent, of course, do appear in Season 1. And it's my hope that whenever the point arrives in which we're wrapping the series, that we'll have encountered all of the principal actors from the Next Generation. And his final question was, why do you think Star Trek has endured as a franchise for all these years? And Stewart answers this. He says, hope. It's the dominant emotion behind everything that we did on the Next Generation, and as I'm beginning to discover on Picard, too. It's always been part of the content of Star Trek that it will be attempting to create a better future with the certain belief that a better future is possible if the right kind of work and the right kind of people are engaged in that. And my feeling was that as I look around, all around our world today, there's never been a more important moment when entertainment and show business can address some of the issues that were potentially damaging our world today. Now, I'm not saying that we're turning Star Trek into a political show, not remotely. What we're making is entertainment, but that it should reflect, perhaps in a subtle and gentle way, the world that we're living in, is what Star Trek has always done, and I think that that's important. Now, the interesting thing about that, his answer to that last question, is, as I mentioned, and as he even mentioned in his answers, there was a point where Patrick Stewart and Jean-Luc Picard merged. He called it the third season of The Next Generation. That was some of their very best shows, started emerging during that time. And so Picard became who Patrick Stewart was. He infused so much of himself into that role. And I think what you saw in yesterday's debut, you can't say last night anymore, because it debuted yesterday on All Access. You can watch it on demand. Episode 1 showed us Patrick Stewart merged, fused with Captain Picard, the kind of person he is, the kind of man he is. And I think that is what, for me, drew me into the series last night. Maybe some of it is a little bit of reaching that age. I'm certainly not in my late 80s, as the Picard character is supposed to be, but I have found in my own life, pushing 60, that you start to evolve a little bit. There are things you think about in a different way. There are things that you become that you weren't when you were younger. And I think Patrick Stewart, you look at his personal life, I don't agree with everything he says when it comes to his politics or his worldviews or so on. That doesn't matter. What I see is a man who has become, in a sense, it's like the Velveteen Rabbit. It's like he's become real. He is who he is. And he's brought that to the character of Picard. And so this is what Star Trek always tried to achieve to do. Not just be the wagon train to the stars that Gene Roddenberry first saw it as, but a way to put out these little morality plays, which I mentioned in the first segment, that the original Star Trek series was meant to do, which is how Gene Roddenberry envisioned it. And so Picard, to me, last night was, I'm going to say it again, it was elegant. And it started to reopen. It brings the viewer back to some of the past that if you never watched the Next Generation series, you're not going to get, but they ease you into that to try to introduce characters and features that created the man that Picard has now become. He's like the old wise man on the mountain, living reclusively a bit, but his quiet life. And there is a deepness to Picard that I saw come out in the show last night that I really enjoyed. And so in looking for all these different things to try to give you a good taste of what I felt about the show last night, here's some of the reviews that came out, just little snippets of reviews for last night. Patrick Stewart has returned to the Star Trek fold as Jean-Luc Picard for the first time on screen since 2002. Now, the new series, which is going to air in the UK on Amazon Prime Video, same in America, centers on the Enterprise captain, who will be rubbing shoulders with some familiar faces in forthcoming episodes. Reviews of the spin-off show are in, and nostalgia aside, it seems critics are impressed by what they've seen. This is a compilation of just a few of them. The Telegraph says Stewart acts his socks off in Picard. It's a freight train performance from one of our great Shakespearean actors. He reimagines the once steely captain of the Enterprise as a melancholic and haunted figure drifting unhappily into his twilight years. Although I have to insert here, he doesn't come off to me as unhappy. He comes off to me as a man who has a lot of memories, some griefs, and some perhaps regrets. And he's moving into his old age almost with the question, is this all there is? But this is how we see him. But to go on with this review, there are moments you're not quite sure if it's Star Trek you're watching or a high-concept take on King Lear. But in this age of Marvel movies and bear-burn fantasy romps, is that enough to restore Star Trek to its previous preeminence? The answer, judging from the first episode of Star Trek Picard, is probably. Though perhaps not as emphatically and irresistibly as fans might wish. You get some fans out there, the diehards, who really understand the underlying message of Trek, that are going to really click into this new Picard, not new Picard, this evolved Picard, and click into this series. But then there are those fans that want a science fiction thriller. And the nice thing is you're starting to see in the first episode the merging of these two. And it's coming in that respect. Variety magazine said, the series seems at first so tentative, but it moves within the first 3 hours, that'd be the 3 episodes, to a place that promises as much excitement and movement as there already has been insight into its beaten-down protagonist. A show that suggests it'll be worth sticking around for. The New York Times said Picard, the second streaming Star Trek series after Star Trek Discovery, is a peak TV experience, and it immediately feels, on the surface at least, as if it could be the franchise's best small-screen offering. The Radio Times said, far from just being a nostalgia-ridden vehicle for Patrick Stewart, though it certainly is that as well, Picard is brilliant. It's fun, it's imaginative, and it's full of the ethical quandaries that made The Next Generation such a great watch, along with newly involving, emotional, and thematically rich stories that thematically rich story that acts both as a sequel to the world of The Next Generation and a comment on our own society. Already I'm desperate to see more. That's kind of where it left me, too, last night. After I watched that, I cannot wait. I was a little put out that they didn't put the whole series up so I could binge watch it in 2 days and then ache for 9 months till the next season comes out. So, but it's episode at a time, and so you can absorb it. And really, as this critique said, I'm desperate to see more. Rolling Stone said, Stewart... Whoa. Sorry about those of you watching visually. My desk, the bolt just released or something. The whole right side of my desk dipped down about 3 inches. That's going to have to be fixed after the show. So, Rolling Stone says, Stewart returning to the role would be reason enough to watch. But this is an actual show, rather than the greatest hits collection. So by the time this older Picard actually says, engage, in a scene, it's not in any way pandering, but something Star Trek Picard is and its great star have entirely earned. And it's a joy to behold. So, and everybody, all these recommend, if you have not seen it, you should avail yourself to it and see it. Something else I have up here. There's an article that came out that said Star Trek Picard, our admirable admiral of space opera, baldly, they said, goes back into action. And so whatever else it might be about, this latest iteration of the Star Trek franchise is not concerned with boldly going. The frontier spirit of the early series has been replaced by something more complex, less active, at least at the beginning. What used to be a space opera with tolerant cowboys wrestling on the polystyrene rocks of interplanetary California has become instead a kind of detective story in which the old gunslinger must haul himself out of retirement and solve a mystery. Patrick Stewart's Jean-Luc Picard, the admirable admiral, must atone for his past mistakes, while also overcoming the cynicism of those who have yet to forgive his errors. Is that too abstract? Well, an element of patience is required. You know, I'm reading that from this critique, and I wouldn't say that. I don't think you need patience. I think you need to enter this series if you understood who the original character was, and even if you don't, wanting to see where he's going and what he's doing. I didn't feel impatient, like I needed patience to watch this last night. That's not required. What's required is a desire to be entertained, a desire to enjoy what you're seeing, a desire to soak in information about somebody whose character you loved years ago and where he is now, and the story that they've created to carry that aging figure into something new. It's like something I talked about the other day, where we never mind about that. I'm not going to get into that because I'm going to run out of time before I get to talk about that. Maybe I'll hit that again another time. Never mind, I even started that. So, Picard's showrunner, the Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Michael Chabon, talked Stewart into revisiting the character by citing Samuel Beckett, though little of the comic miserablist's influence made it into the final scripts. There's a sense of weariness about this Picard, but also this is maybe where the impatience comes in, more accurately, a sense of impatience. There's no uniform for Picard, and the early episodes are all about his struggles to get a ship, not just any ship, a warp-capable reconnaissance ship, and to get a ship he has to be certified fit for interstellar service, and while a medical examination finds him in excellent shape for a relic, he's dying. The symptoms, he's dying, he's old, he's elderly. The symptoms of his ailment are nightmares, and a tendency to shout at the news headlines. The dreams are lovely, he suggests. It's the waking up I'm beginning to regret. Let's examine Stewart. Take a look at that head. baldly, Stewart's suitability for going into the world of interstellar diplomacy relies both on his alien visage and the tone of his voice. It's oddly reassuring to find a Shakespearean with a Rada diction in an allegorical future where peace is threatened by, bad robots, refugees, and transmissions from off-world. That's before you get into the Romulan secret police, which we actually see in the first episode. Quirks. Picard has quirks. He drinks Earl Grey decaf, though he offers it with milk to a guest, which seems oddly non-you. He lives in France, in a vineyard which even now resembles a nostalgic idyllic setting. Picture if you saw the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe, and they would show those long shots of the wheat fields coming up to the tree-lined lane that led to his estate. That's kind of the feel you get with Picard's vineyard. It even now resembles a nostalgic idyllic. He looks after his dog, who he named Number One. He drinks tea. And he dies a little bit more every day. Against his judgment, Picard is preparing for a TV interview. And they probably don't call it a TV in the 25th century, but the format is recognizably hostile. The geopolitics are confusing. Mars is on fire. Humanitarian missions have been abandoned. But the long and short of it is that Picard has been ambushed by a news team. And there's disagreement over tactics, and Picard invokes, of all things, World War I's Dunkirk. The interviewer, not unreasonably given the century, looks a little blank and, blinks her eyes like a doe caught in the headlights, but Picard is incensed. And so it goes. And there's this girl named Daj, played by Issa Briones. She turns up at Picard's vineyard, out of nowhere, knowing things she shouldn't know, looking oddly familiar. Picard regards her visit as a wake-up call, like a positronic alarm bell. There's phasers, there's chop-sockery, there's pointy ears, there's spaceships. Picard wears a space-age errand jumper. Comfort is his continuing mission. And so this is how we enter the later world of Captain Jean-Luc Picard. And this is what we see of him. And this is what draws you, I think, and all of us into who he's become. And you have what I found a great appeal, because you see the very human Picard being played by the very human Patrick Stewart in all of its elegance and all of its sobriety. There's a bit of sadness connected to it. And so it's very, for me, it was very appealing to watch and very appealing to, I'm going to be watching it unfold. There's another article from the IndieWire that I wanted to make mention of here. And we've only got a few minutes left, but let's hit it. Let's see. Yes. And so Star Trek Picard review is Patrick Stewart revisits The Next Generation for the nostalgia generation. Captain Jean-Luc Picard is back, they say. The CBS All Access series sends the retired captain on a return trip to space, and that's pretty much it, is what they say. So what's to say about Picard? That can be said. Given this review is a spoiler-free zone, needs to be said that CBS All Access is ostensibly reviving one of the Star Trek franchise's most utilized captains, and thus rebooting one of fandom's favorite shows. Of course, the question can apply directly to the man himself. What's left to say about Picard that hasn't been said in 7 seasons of great television, 4 films of vastly disparate quality, and in numerous appearances in Star Trek-related stories, saddling the pure of heart, bald of head leader with fresh baggage and renewed purpose should motivate the most prospective viewers to say, engage, each week of this 10-episode ride. But there's a lingering feeling of missed opportunity hovering over our initial re-entry. Star Trek Picard may represent a new chapter for Patrick Stewart's beloved Jean-Luc, but it's not trying to enlist new fans as much as catering to the old ones, which I don't think is a problem at all. And I'm going to leave off on what they have to say there so I can wrap this in the last minute and to say, if you have thought about watching this series, go watch the first episode. You're going to be impressed by everything from the music in the opening titles to the character that Patrick Stewart is in his real life, I think, take away the fictional trappings, to seeing where Jean-Luc has come. And you're going to see, I think, a series that's going to open us up into a lot of great science fiction adventure, but at the same time show you a man who has, perhaps to link into everything we've talked about for the last month, a man who has become awake and aware. I think you'll enjoy it. So until next time, folks, have a good weekend. We'll see you Monday night right back here. Good night.